how to think about it, but I am going to suggest to you that your obligation as a student, as a citizen, be it of this country or the larger globe that we share, as a concerned human being, is to at least spend some of your waking hours considering what you're going to do and how you're going to do it to bring us to that very different place, the place that we've always lied and said we were already, but where we have never actually been and yet must be in a very short period of time, because if we don't do it, our children, our grandchildren, if we're lucky enough to have them either now or at some point in the future, are going to be back in this room. And they may not be listening to me in 20 or 30 years, but they'll be listening to somebody talk about this. Only by that time, I guarantee you that the risk of total social collapse will be far greater. The odds of success, justice, and real democracy will be incredibly remote, and they will curse us for our indifference. Thank you all so very much for being here today. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a mic. It's coming down the center row. If you are interested and physically able to come to the mic, please do so. If you do not want to come to the mic or not able to come to the mic physically, you can raise your hand. I'll call on you, and we'll take a few questions. I will then take you back to the back, sell you some merchandise. That was my subliminal advertising. I have 3 books and a video in the back. Be happy to sell them to you. But if you have any questions, you want to come to the mic, or if you just want to raise your hand and speak loudly, we'll do it. Or, you know, we can stare at each other for like 20 minutes, and I'm still going to take your money and sell you books. So might as well ask a question, you know. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question. Yesterday I was talking to some people about some political things, and I'm not an expert on those things. But we were trying to figure out this problem of how to fix it, I guess, and she kind of laughed. I was like, why don't we like help each other and stuff, and community centers and blah, 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 and you know, inviting each other into our own lives and bringing back this idea of humanity and stuff like that. And she was like, back to the basics. And I was like, I mean, I didn't mean to think of it that way, but I mean, is it really that funny of a thought? Is it bad to think of it as back to the basics, or?
No, I mean, a lot of these things are pretty basic. You know, and I'm going to talk a lot about this in my next book that I'm working on right now, which is really more an exploration of class and economic injustice, still through a race lens and a gender lens, because I think those are important. But it's really looking at how we have become, in the last 40 years, a culture, for lack of a better term, and I'm probably not the first to use it, but I'm calling it sort of a culture of cruelty. And it's a culture of such rampant and hyper-individualism that we just don't have time to apparently care much about people below us anymore. You know, there was a time when if you were working class, everybody around you was working class. You didn't see regular images in media of people above you that you could aspire to and that you would like, by God, I'm going to be there someday. Like, people knew we had a class system, and if you wanted to change it, you were going to have to rise up against it. That was understood, and as a result, we did things for each other. Now, we still did it in a racially discriminatory way, so like all those New Deal programs that helped out white working class folks were oftentimes not there for people of color. But at least there was a mentality, right, that we are our brother and sister's keeper. There was this mentality that we have a collective responsibility to do for those who find themselves suffering through no fault of their own. And now we have come to a place where we have moved very much away from that and that notion of community. And you see that in our politics. You know, you see it in the rhetoric of 47% of the American people just don't want to work. They want to be dependent on government. They're takers, not makers. That's the kind of rhetoric that if you had said that 70 years ago in American politics, you would have been, your ass would have been done. Like, well, and I guess some people's asses are done, even though they said it this year. But for the most part, it wouldn't have even been close. Like, no one, 70 years ago, only the most evil, venal, rich people. Like, that was like the mentality of Scrooge, right? You remember Christmas Carol, right? And remember when they come around to try to get money from Scrooge for the charity that they were getting money for, and what is Scrooge's famous line? He says, what, are there no workhouses, no prisons, right? Now, you do realize that when Dickens wrote that character, his intent was that Scrooge was the asshole. Like, you get that, right? Like he was not a Dickensian hero, he was the asshole. But now, here we are 100 and however many years since Christmas Carol was written, and we got major political figures in the United United States who act like Scrooge was some hard-nosed philosopher. No, he was an asshole. And the fact that we've gotten away from that to where we actually have people who will say that we don't want, I mean, you'll hear it every night on television or in the radio. You hear people talk about don't feed poor people because they won't know how to feed themselves. It's like going to the zoo, and if they tell you not to feed the alligators because then they'll never be able to find their own food. Who does this? Where does this animalistic, dehumanizing rhetoric come from? I mean, I'm sure there have always been people who've done that, but they used to be pariahs when they did that. And in the last 40 years, it's become purely like rational mainstream. When you can have a presidential candidate whose icon is Ayn Rand, right? Anybody ever read that trash? Like, this is like the most obtuse, absurd 1,120 pages filled with crap that you will ever read, which is why it's really popular with 14-year-old boys, but most people grow out of it, right? This is someone whose philosophy wasn't just that government should be small or virtually non-existent, but that even private charity was evil, that altruism as a motivator for human behavior was evil, that it made you a horrible person if you were altruistic because you should only do for you. This is sickness, and we have people running for office. Oh my God, Ayn Rand is why I got into politics. Ayn Rand, what the hell? How is that? Right, that's because we have really lost this connectivity to one another. So in a way, what you're talking about may be very basic, but we've gotten so very far away, we've retrogressed to such a place in terms of the way we speak about other people, and particularly when they're below us on the power chain. It used to be understood, like even by old monarchies, right? You remember the old image of kings and queens would have the court jester come and they were like the stand-up comics of their day, right? And they would come and act like a fool and do all kinds of silly stuff, and they would tell jokes. Like, who do you think the court jester made fun of? When the court jester came before the crown, they made fun of the crown. That was sort of like the irony of it. Like, that was the one time that you could make fun of the really powerful people. So the court jester would come and totally just diss the king and the queen, and they'd all laugh, and it was no big deal, and they wouldn't cut your head off because you were the royal the royal clown or the royal fool or whatever, the court jester. But it would have been ridiculous for the court jester to come and tell jokes about the peasants down the hill. Like, that would just be considered cruel. That would be crass. That would be piling on. That would be redundant. Why? But now that's what we do. We make fun of the people at the bottom. We have this rhetoric of demonization of people at the bottom that I think we really need to explore. And so in a sense, in order for us to do anything about our political and our economic and social culture, we do have to get back to some really basic conversations about who we are as a people and a nation and what we want to be. And I think we've gotten away from that as we moved into this very hyper-individualistic mode of thinking that begins really early. We teach it in school. Our kids, first couple of years, kindergarten, first, second grade, it's all very collective and collaborative. You may not remember that, right? But if you have kids, like kids they sit at the table together, they help each other, right? And the teacher encourages that. And then by like third grade and a little less, fourth grade, fifth grade, it's like, keep your eyes on your paper. If you're working together, you're cheating. Don't work together, that's cheating. And now you've got to get a better grade than that one because now we're grading and now we're keeping track. And you want to be the valedictorian, don't you? And you want to get into a better college, don't you? And you want to get into a better grad school, don't you? And so we've really created this treadmill that both rhetorically and I think programmatically keeps us in this position. So what you're saying may be basic, but that doesn't mean it isn't true in a lot of ways, right? Thank you. Yeah, you bet. Other questions? Yes.
Sorry, I'm really short, so.
That's okay.
Hi, my name is Shahad Khanum, and welcome to Grand Valley. My question is, how does your privilege as a white straight man impact your role as a social justice activist? And how do you hold yourself accountable to not perpetuating your own privilege as you educate about racism?
They're both really great questions, and I'm glad you asked them. Needless to say, being white, being male, being straight, being able-bodied, being, now upper middle class, though I didn't start out that way, and being college educated are all, and there are probably some others I haven't thought of, that all of them serve to amplify my voice, right, with or without the microphone, figuratively speaking, if not literally, because those things give me in audiences more assumed credibility. For some people, I mean, not for others, but for other members of those dominant groups, right? We know that white folks are just more apt to hear it, really hear it, and maybe take it in their bodies without as much defensiveness if it comes from a white person. Men, same thing from another guy, et cetera, on down the line. So there's no question that happens. And so because that happens, all of us who do this work, whether we're members of just one or two dominant groups or several like I am, have to have this conversation with ourselves and with our other allies and co-conspirators, if you will, about accountability. And so I've been engaged in that conversation with folks for, a good 20 years. And I can't tell you that I've come up with any clear and fast answers. I don't think any of us have. We've usually come up with a couple of guidelines that we try and follow. A year ago, J. Love Calderon and myself came up with, and she's another wonderful educator, activist, and cultural critic, and we tried to come up with and got a lot of feedback from both folks of color and other white allies, sort of a code of ethics for white anti-racist. And I have that. It's on my website. It's on hers. We've gotten it around, not as much as we'd like. It's sort of a 10-point rule about what we try to do. And it's not that it's necessarily the only 10 things, but it's a handful of things. And so as I'm trying to recall the list off the top of my head, it's things like making sure that in our own social media, in our own websites, whenever we're putting written work out there, whether I'm writing books or whether we're doing blog posts or we're doing articles, that when we are talking about theories and ideas developed first and most by people of color, that we credit those ideas and those theories, that we make sure that folks know precisely where much of the wisdom comes from. And so we're very quick to call out both our mentors and to note who they were, but also to steer people, particularly white folks when it comes to race, toward those authors, toward those educators, so that people can then maybe start with me or J. Love or whomever, Paul Kivel or Peggy McIntosh or whomever they start with, but ultimately know they have to go deeper. It's like, it's one thing, you can start, if you want to start liking rock and roll with Elvis Presley, that's fine, but you got to go deeper to the people that actually created the music that brought about Elvis Presley, right? And so you have to do that. It's fine to start where you start, but you have to get deeper. So that's one of the things. The second thing that I try to do, and J. Love does too, and several of us, is we make sure that a portion of our incomes go back into community organizing work. And so the group that I work with, for example, that books my speeches is a nonprofit organization in Oakland that takes 25 to 30% of all the speakers, myself included, all of our fees, puts them back into grassroots organizing, leadership development, community building, mostly in communities of color with campuses and other smaller groups. So we try to make sure we're doing that. And then the other thing is just making sure you have an accountability network of people who check your work, who give you regular feedback, who you can count on to be critical and take their criticism seriously. And so in my case as a writer, it's weird, right? Because as a writer, you have one set of accountability rules, and as an activist, you have another. When you're an organizer, it's a little bit more straightforward because you're in a community, and so you know that accountability there means following the lead of the people in the community, doing what they tell you needs to be done. And when I was a community organizer, that was my very strict approach to accountability. Once you're not doing that and you're sort of a writer, which is more of like an artistic endeavor, it's a little tougher because obviously the responsibility of the artist is to tell the artist's truth, right? And not necessarily worry about how others feel about it. But as an activist and an educator, I have to think about impact and I have to think about how it comes off. And I've learned over the years that I have to be very careful in the way that I approach these issues, because I am given leeway to be angry in a way that others are not. And I am given leeway to be sarcastic in a way that others are not. It doesn't mean that I can't bring about anger or sarcasm and use those as tools, but I have to be mindful of it. So in my writing, what I've done, for instance, when I write an article, or in the case of White Like Me, my first book, when I wrote it the first time in 2004 and it was published in 2005, I got a lot of feedback, some of it good, some of it very critical, from people who I know and respect and care deeply for, and who I know respect and care deeply for me. And they were folks who said, look, this was really good, Tim, but we think you need to do some new stuff, like do a new edition and change some things because you didn't quite deal with this piece or you didn't deal with that piece, and we'd really like for you to do that, both because it would make the book stronger, but also because we feel it's important for you as a white male to do it. And so I said, okay, and I went back and I rewrote it. And it was a little better the second time, and then I got other folks that were like, okay, that's really good, but, and they kept giving me, so now I've redone the book actually 2 times, even though I didn't have to, but because I wanted to. I felt like it was an obligation to make the work as precise or as strong or as on point and as responsive to what people of color have said to me about my work as it can be. And it's still constantly a work in progress, though. It's always, sort of evolving. I take it, additionally, my accountability means that I have to work with the schools that bring me in to make sure that they're bringing in artists and speakers and talent of color to continue these conversations. It's one thing if you bring in like one white person a year to do this as the white ally slot. I get it. Like it's valuable. It's valuable for white folks to see that there's such a slot as the white ally slot, so to speak, that you can be that. But at the same time, it's really critical that schools don't fall back on relying on white folks or relying just on men to come in and do an anti-sexism message, or relying on straight and cisgendered allies to come and give that message. But having some of that is helpful, I think, as long as in the long run it continues to move the conversation forward. Whether it does or not, it's a campus by campus thing, and it's hard to know. But I appreciate the question, and I'm always, by the way, if people have ideas about accountability, not just directed at me, but really at dominant group ally members generally, please, by all means, feel free to send those to me. I'd like to get that kind of feedback. I want to get those kinds of ideas from people, because sometimes when you're in the middle of it, you know, you think you sort of know, but then there's something else someone might think of that, oh, this would be something you could do that would be even more helpful, and, you know, I might not think of it. So I'm always open to more suggestions on that.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Hi, I guess due to a lack of adequate research on my part, I'm not astute to the topic that I'm going to ask you about, but could you give us your insight or enlightenment on what you think about Ronald Reagan and his impact on the minority community?
Well, you know, it's sort of sad to say, but very true. Those of us who lived through the Reagan era, I found many of us now feeling this way, that for many of us, we're actually nostalgic for him because it's gotten so much worse, you know, that the right in this country today makes Ronald Reagan look like a flaming moderate by comparison. You know, the kinds of rhetoric that spokespersons for the right will use today to demonize the poor or to demonize immigrants is the kind of language that he, whatever his views might have been on those things, probably wouldn't have used and rarely did. So it's sort of sad that the country's moved so far in that direction rhetorically that he looks good by comparison. Now, that said, he doesn't look good, and I want to be clear on that. I think Ronald Reagan was the sort of titular head of a resurgent right wing, and he had been that since long before he became president, going all the way back to the Goldwater campaign in '64, and he was a spokesperson, media mouthpiece for a lot of conservative causes. He campaigned for Goldwater. He was governor of California, of course. During that time, you know, is when the right really began to forge this alliance between social conservative, religious, fundamentalist evangelical conservatives for whom the issues were primarily about sex and sexuality, about women's rights and freedoms, about reproductive rights certainly beginning by the late 60s or early 70s, and then later on about the LGBT liberation struggle. The forging of a movement that encompassed them, who had always been sort of separate. The social conservative folks, in fact, prior to the Reagan, Goldwater, Phyllis Schlafly era beginning in the 60s, had always, not always, but many of them had been of the opinion that they didn't do politics. Like, they were sort of separate and apart. All they did was tend their flock in their churches, right? And then the right under Reagan and Goldwater and these folks come along, and Goldwater wasn't really a social conservative. Goldwater was sort of a libertarian, you know, he believed the free market could solve all problems, but he didn't really get into a lot of the sexuality wars that the Schlaflys and the Jerry Falwells did. But his side was sort of the economic conservative, the fiscal conservative, the low-tax, small government, libertarian conservative side. And the bringing together of those two sides, which is something maybe Goldwater begins, but frankly Reagan perfects, I think is a critical step in the process of backlash to the civil rights era, to the women's rights movement, to the gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered rights movement. All of these movements that were rooted in identity oppression had their backlash, and Reagan was the titular head of that backlash. He sort of stood for that older America. You know, you'd always see him in these absurd pictures on his ranch with his cowboy hat, you know, and his bolo tie or whatever, and on the back of his horse, which really, you know, we laughed about it at the time. We did the same thing with George W. Bush when he'd go to his ranch. It's like every white president needs to apparently have a frickin' ranch and a cowboy hat and a horse. But really, if you think about the symbolism of that, it was pretty deep. I mean, it harkened back, consciously or subconsciously, to this sort of cowboys and Indians movies, right? It was this very Western, very idealized, very mythologized notion of the Wild West and the frontier, and by God, it was the John Waynes of the world that settled it. Well, John Wayne was like Ronald Reagan, an actor who got out of service in actual combat so that he could make movies about combat. It's really interesting how, as a country, we turned John Wayne into a superhero, badass, macho guy, and Ronald Reagan, same thing. And both of these men took a dive on military service. John Wayne literally dodges the draft so he can keep making movies, right? And he becomes a badass. Oh, you're such a badass. No, not really. Not at all. Same thing with Ronald Reagan, but they created this mythologized, heroic, straight, virile male with the square jaw and the cowboy hat, riding in to save America from whatever endangered it. Communism, right? Feminism, the civil rights movement, black power, later on the gay rights movement, all of these things. And so I think Reagan, he can't take all the blame, because like I said, it's gotten worse since he was around. I mean, Ronald Reagan actually, when he was governor of California, he actually signed into law the affirmative action programs in that state that weren't eliminated until 1996. I mean, he actually, when you go back and look at some of that, by comparison, he wasn't that right wing, but he was a good actor, and he sort of played that role really, really well. It created a whole new rhetoric. And I think his role is the rhetorician more than the actual instrumentalist. You know, he didn't really do much of what the far right wanted him to do on social policy, and he only did part of what they wanted on economic policy. He did a lot of what they wanted on foreign policy. That was probably the area where he did most of what they wanted more than anywhere else, though I think they wanted him to invade Cuba as well, so he didn't do that, but he did a lot of other stuff. But what he did was he played that rhetoric. He played that role. He helps to really popularize some of the anti-welfare, anti-safety net rhetoric that we now hear, ramped up to the nth degree. And he did it in a way that was very callous toward peoples of color. Even back when he was governor of California during the riots after Dr. King's assassination, and even before that during some fair housing battles in California, he was famous for saying that he hoped that the rioters who were looting food ate the food and got botulism, and it would serve them right. And then he said, if there has to be a bloodbath whenever there was a campus rebellion or a civil rights rebellion or whatever, let's get it over with. Let's just kill them all. Let's get it over with. And he said, these black folks that are protesting for fair housing, they don't even really want to live in white neighborhoods. They just want to cause trouble. I mean, he was notorious for this really indifference. And whether that reflects on him and his character at the core level, or whether it just shows him to be incredibly manipulative and disingenuous and deliberately playing those tunes. I mean, there's a reason he starts his campaign for the presidency in 1980 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is only famous for one thing, and that's the murder of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner there in 1964. And he knew that when he went to the Neshoba County Fair and gave a talk where he talked about the importance of states' rights, and he used all this rhetoric that clearly played upon racial anxieties. It was only 16 years after these murders. The killers were still in the community, some of them, certainly their families. He had to know what he was doing. Whether it was deliberate or just political, the effect was the same, and I think it set us on a path that we have not recovered from yet. And I think so, he certainly has to bear some of the responsibility for that, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, hi, Discrimination again. Hi, Tim.
Hey.
Your talk was fantastic. Thank you for
Thanks.
coming back again. I work with a grassroots organization. We do food justice here in this community.
Uh-huh.
And I was recently invited to a racial equity training that involved, I don't know how to describe it, but hopefully my question will make sense. It involved us reading two articles. One is called The Equity Trap, a useful construction of preparing principals to lead schools that are successful with racial diversity, diverse students. And it basically talked about how throw the race piece out of the way, it's really about access. And they started a PowerPoint with
Right.
Bill Gates saying that because his high school had access to a computer lab,
Right.
is why he is where he is now. So ignore all those other things. And then we had another article we were supposed to read called Towards a Structural Racism Framework, which basically said, we have all the data now to show that race is nothing more than a social construct.
Right.
And so we don't need to talk about equity or equality, that we really need to be focusing on this and understand that that's old school, what you're hearing now, basically what your talk is.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? Because I would imagine students are being exposed to this kind of.
Well, although I don't know who wrote these pieces and I don't know the leadership of the people pushing them, I think I probably can guess a little bit about them. And where they are in the identity spectrum, and where their backgrounds are, maybe not. I think that the idea that things are about access and not race or class or gender or sexuality to call it disingenuous would be an understatement. First of all, access is contingent on that. Bill Gates went to a private academy, a very expensive private school that had very few, if any, people of color, and certainly hardly any working class or poor folks, not by accident. Independent/private schools are elite places, and they're elite by choice. And I'm not saying that to say they're horrible. I'm just saying, let's not pretend that access was just coincidental. Like Bill Gates is walking by his public school that normally doesn't have any resources, and holy shit, computer lab. How did that happen? It's very true to his story. There's no doubt if he did not have, if he'd even gone to a different private school in Seattle, because there were several, his wasn't the only one. If he had gone to one of the other ones that didn't have that computer lab, true enough, he may not become the Bill Gates that he becomes. He's probably still going to do all right because his daddy was not poor. His mom was a bank vice president. His dad was something similar to that also. Not wealthy, but well off and well educated. He might not become the Bill Gates that he is now, but the idea that if you put that same computer lab in Seattle in 1967 or 68, whenever it was, if you do it at Garfield High, which at that time was pretty much a black school in one of the black neighborhoods of Seattle, that somehow that's all that's going to matter. Like the pre-existing class background isn't going to matter, the pre-existing educational background's not going to matter, the discrimination that those kids are going to face when they actually try to get jobs in this new industry known as computing, that's not going to matter. That's just absurd. Does access matter? Yes, but what are the things that are the gatekeepers for access? Access is not some amorphous thing that exists independent of race, independent of class, independent of gender. Access is over-determined in our culture by things like race and class and gender and luck. I mean luck, because the truth is if Bill Gates is 3 years younger than he is, he's already done with that school before they get the computer. If he's 3 years older than he is, if he's 3 years older, he's already done. If he's 3 years younger, somebody else is in on it before he is. A lot of stuff is luck. A lot of stuff is totally happenstance, circumstance, and definitely has nothing to do with your own effort. So on the one hand, I think the only valuable part of that piece, as you're describing it, is at least it's willing to acknowledge it isn't just about your own initiative. That's good. They seem to be aware that there's something else going on. But I would say unless we understand the way that race and class and gender and sexuality and all of these other dynamics affect who does and doesn't have access, there's got to be a reason, doesn't there, that AP and honors classes are 2 to 3 times more available in schools that serve mostly white students. Is that just a coincidence? Did that just happen? Is that just oh, wow, we just picked names out of a hat, and it just so happened that the mostly white schools have those classes and the mostly black and brown schools don't? Or the fact that schools that serve mostly students of color have twice as many new teachers with very little experience as the schools that serve white students, and the schools that serve white students are more likely to have the most experienced, the ones with the most seniority, the best track records? Is that a coincidence? No. Access is being determined. In fact, in schools we know that even now a study of the Department of Education a year ago found that even within a school, so take one school, not just a larger school system or the larger country, take one individual site, the teachers who are assigned to teach certain classes in that school, if it's a racially mixed school, right? I know a lot of schools aren't that diverse, but if it is, you will find overwhelmingly that the teachers teaching the classes that are filled with white folks, who are often the honors and the advanced placement type classes, are the ones that have been teaching the longest, who have the most experience, the best track records, and the teachers who were teaching the students of color in the very same building, just maybe on the other side of the building, are the ones who are first year, second year teachers, already getting burned out, don't have very much training, right? Don't have a lot of experience. They might be really well intentioned. Some of them might even turn out to be great teachers, but they're sort of guinea pigs in that first couple of years, oh, go teach those kids. Now, really, that's sort of illogical, right? You would think that it would make the most sense to have the teachers with the most experience and the most success teaching the kids who have the most challenges. That would make sense. So really, we should be paying, the ones who have 20 years of experience should be in those classes, and the ones who've only been doing it a year or two can go teach the advanced placement kids, because that's got to be easier, at least in a sense. They don't have the same obstacles and barriers, but we don't do it that way. Is that some coincidence, or is that because, well, the data tells us why it is. It's that what's happening is you have parents and this is in public schools, forget private schools, this is just in public schools, who lobby to make sure that their kids are in those programs, and they feel empowered to do it. They feel empowered to go in and say, by God, this is what I want and I expect it. And a lot of other folks, whether they're folks of color or just working class, parents of any color, oftentimes don't feel empowered to do that. So is that, whose fault is that? Well, you know, we might say, well, the parent needs to take the initiative. Well, yeah, I mean, as a parent, you maybe should, but if you don't feel empowered to, if you feel like you're going to go demand that and someone's going to go, well, your kid's not, you know, who wants to have that experience where someone looks at them like, oh, I don't think your child can do that. I don't think your child is ready for that. Whereas, you know, a white parent, middle class or above, goes in and says, my kid needs to be an AP. That kid could be a horrible student. I was a lousy student for most of my time in school, but I was always in those tracks because my mom advocated for me in spite of my grades, and the teachers were all convinced that I was really quite bright in spite of my grades. So we had them fooled for 12 years. It was awesome. But that was about privilege. That wasn't just access. Like, I was in the same school with a lot of kids of color, so technically we had the same school, the same access, but we didn't really have the same experience. And that, to me, was about race and class and all those things. And then the second piece, you know, yeah, race is a social construct. This is not news. So the fact that somebody actually is like, wow, look at what I found out. Race isn't biological. It's just some made-up crap. Wow. So let's not talk about it. Okay, wait. The first part of what you said made a lot of sense. The second part did not follow from the first part. To say that because race isn't real, we shouldn't talk about race, right? It's like, okay, well, in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, there were no witches, right? Witches were not real. But a lot of men thought they were. And because a lot of men thought they were, the fact that witches were a social construct didn't matter. Women died, right, because of anti-witchism. So anti-witchism, or in this case just straight up sexism and patriarchal oppression of women, happened even though the category that was being oppressed didn't exist. And there's no such thing scientifically as a witch, but it didn't matter, did it? Because as long as people thought that there were, same thing with race. There may not be such a thing as a black person biologically. But as long as there are people who think that there are black people, and that, by the way, black people are inferior to other people, then by God, race is real, whether it is scientific or whether it's just a figment of our imagination, it still does damage. And so again, this idea that we don't have to talk about that is very convenient, I think, for us to say we just need to talk about equity and access, but not the things that create inequity and lack of access. Like, that just doesn't follow to me. Makes no sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, as I look at the big picture and prospects for equity in this country, I get real discouraged. I think in particular about the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, and I think about the horrific amounts of money being contributed to political campaigns and have now become a political necessity for anyone who wants to stand for public office.
Yeah.
Can you give us any ray of hope that something's going to work out in the midst of this undue influence by people of power and privilege and wealth?
Well, I mean, the good news is there are some rumblings, and they started very early after Citizens United was decided. And for those who don't know the case, just the thumbnail sketch, this is a Supreme Court decision that basically allowed corporations more or less unlimited influence in terms of contributions to political campaigns. They've been reined in a much more direct way previously, and now you can get different groups combining cash and sending in much more than they would have otherwise, and, you know, nonstop commercials and very little restriction on what they can do. And it's all, of course, follows from something the Supreme Court did a century ago or more, which was declare that corporations are people, which, if you actually know the history of that decision, and of course they didn't mean that literally, right? They meant that in the sense of having rights. So corporations have rights of due process, just like people, and corporations have the right to free speech, just like people. So the court really said that a century ago, and then a century later, now the Supreme Court confirms it with a decision like Citizens United, which does in fact follow from the original stupid decision. Like, if you think corporations are people, then yeah, I suppose this makes perfect sense. But if you think corporations are people, you're sort of an idiot, and not thinking very clearly in a philosophical sense about the impact of that judgment. The good news is that people, shortly after that decision, started to organize against it. There actually have been some real resistance to Citizens United in various states around the country that you wouldn't necessarily think of as progressive states. Now, that resistance in places like Montana and North Dakota has not necessarily succeeded, but it has really created a groundswell of grassroots support among folks who recognize the problems of corporate power and are moving forward on that. You have people like what's his name, the former senator from Wisconsin, why am I forgetting his name? Feingold. Feingold, who is now, Russ Feingold is heading up an organization, the purpose of which is really to ultimately move to repeal Citizens United by legislative dictate. I mean, you do realize, of course, legislatures can ultimately invalidate Supreme Court decisions by changing the rules, and that's what the Supreme Court would tell you they want them to do. The court will say, Scalia and those folks will always say, well, it's not that we want to legislate from the bench. We just think that if you want to prohibit this, you need to pass a law prohibiting it, and you need to be clear about your intentions. And so there are some people, Russ Feingold among them, who are trying to do that. I do think that if we talk more about that and talk more about the connections between that unlimited corporate influence and issues of demographic change, because I don't think it's a coincidence that the Supreme Court decides we need more money from, let's be honest, rich white people in the political process at the very moment we want fewer voters voting, right? Like, these things happen at the same time. So all of this campaign, what did you see? You saw the right trying to make sure there was unlimited money in the process, but not unlimited voting. We're going to make it harder for people to vote. We're going to try to make them show photo ID, unless, especially if they're students, right? Because we don't want students to be able to vote easily, because they might fake an ID to vote. Yeah, because that's why we as students make fake ID, to vote. Yeah. I remember when I was making fake ID in college, it was so I could commit election fraud. Yeah, I was quite the criminal. But that, trying to make it harder, because they know that the people less likely to have IDs were lower income, were working class, were folks of color, particularly in large cities where you might not need a driver's license if you have good public transportation, and if you don't have a driver's license, you might not need a photo identification, so then you can't vote, even though there's no evidence of in-person voter fraud anywhere in this country to justify those changes. But they did it to try to make it harder for certain folks to vote. Now, in the long run, it didn't really work the way that they hoped, but it was part and parcel of a larger strategy. Let's get more money in the process, fewer electors. That's what they're trying to do in several states now by rigging the Electoral College and saying, oh, well, that Electoral College thing that we haven't messed with, now I think we ought to get rid of it altogether, but it's a different discussion. No, we're not going to get rid of it. No, because then that would leave it up to a popular vote, and certain folks know they'll never win that again. Or very unlikely to. So no, we got to have an Electoral College, but it's not solid enough, because Pennsylvania, those urban people in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh show up in such large numbers, and they end up outvoting the rural people. And if Obama only wins 2 congressional districts out of 14 or whatever it is, why, he should only get 2 of the Electoral College votes, and the other candidate who gets more districts should get the rest, which makes sense if you believe that people of color are still 3/5 of a human being for the purpose of apportionment, because ultimately that's about what the ratio comes out to be. It would make the votes of rural people in Virginia and Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, places where they're talking about doing this, would make them worth considerably more, 2 or 3 times more for their congressional districts with fewer people in it than the votes of people in the cities, supposedly in the name of justice. All of this is part of a process, and I think if we link these issues, because I think up to now, those have been sort of kept separate. So there's the disenfranchisement of working class and people of color, and then there's the money piece with Citizens United, and I'm not sure that these two sides who are fighting these two things are always talking to each other, because one is sort of focused on big bad corporations and class issues, and the other is focused on race, when really this is part of a larger strategy. And I think it provides an opportunity for us to connect the intersections of class and race in this process, so that we understand that the very people who brought us this it's not a coincidence they're doing it now. It's not a coincidence that they're doing it at the very moment that certain folks' political power is beginning to diminish. So now the only leveler we have is money, right? One person, one vote, we can't win. We got to have $1, one vote, or $10, 20 votes, or, and every country that's had white supremacy as part of its organizing principle has done this. I've spoken in Bermuda. Bermuda did a very similar thing for many years. They had this thing called syndicate voting, where if you owned a piece of property, if you've ever been to Bermuda, there's like several districts in Bermuda, right? And so if you own property in each district, you could vote in each district. And if you, let's say you and 50 other people decided, wow, there's this great piece of land. Now, I can't buy it by myself, but me and my 49 buddies, we can all go in on it together. Then you and your buddies would all get a vote wherever you own property. So if you bought up 3 places of property, 50 of you together, property you never could have owned alone, you would get to vote in each place where you own property with you and your little syndicate of friends. I mean, that was blatant, right? And they finally got rid of that. But now we're sort of trying to do similar stuff, it seems, to rig elections here. And so I think those of us who were concerned about corporate power, rightly so, and maybe have focused on that, and those who have focused on racial inequity and white supremacy, and rightly so, and have focused on that, need to be more interactive with one another, because I think that the reason that Citizens United happens is still rooted in white supremacy, as in fact the whole decision about corporations being people. If you look at the history of the time and why that was, it was really looking at the corporation not just as a person, but as a white person, right? It wasn't just corporations are generic people. Oh no, corporations were to be made people with more rights than any person of color in the country had. So it was really still connected to race. And I think if we have these activists who usually are off doing their own single issue things, maybe talking together about the intersections of those things, then we have a chance at fomenting a movement to push back on that successfully at the state level and also at the federal level. Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Weiss. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Why, in your opinion, is that the fact that in schools there is a lot of information that is not being talked about? Let's say, for example, the achievements of Eastern civilizations or their contributions to science, and especially in the cases of African civilizations, civilizations like Nubia or Egypt, which in fact at the beginning was a black civilization,
Right.
or Zimbabwe, many other, even the Empire of Mali, the Empire of Ghana,
Right.
which were very well-structured societies and which had made a lot of great contributions to science and, well, to many other disciplines of human knowledge. And also, the conquest of the Moors of Europe, of Southern Europe, to be more specific.
Right.
Why is it that all of those things are not talked about in school first?
Right.
And the second thing, why is it that in the media they portray it as if Africans never had any form of civilization, any form of achievements, any meaningful contributions to humanity?
Right.
And what can we do to change that?
Well, in fact, it's not only that the media perpetuates that and the schools perpetuate that, it's that they perpetuate the idea that Africans actually had no history until white people found them. And so when we even talk about Africa in world civ classes, for example, or world history classes, it's almost always taught as this place that is essentially without history until a certain point, and it is that point at which conquest and colonization begins. So the answer, of course, the easy, short, sort of pithy answer is white supremacy, right, to your questions. But the more interesting answer, and this is what is fascinating to me about the way we treat Africa in our classrooms and even our scholarship. You know, there was a time when the things that you've just mentioned were commonly understood by European scholars. Like, it wasn't, what you just said wouldn't have been considered remotely radical or controversial 200 years ago. 150 years ago, Egyptologists, if you actually look at the discipline of Egyptology and those who studied it, there was hardly anyone in the discipline prior to about the 1850s would have denied that most of the early Pharaonic dynasties were dark-skinned Africans. And then they became, over time, they became a mix, but it was always a mixed civilization, but that many of the early Pharaonic dynasties were pretty dark, and certainly people we would consider black today, and even the ones that had lighter pharaohs still had dark-skinned black folks in leadership positions, and it was sort of all over the spectrum. That was understood. Only in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and afterward does that get completely lost in the scholarship. And of course, why? Well, white supremacy at this time, now, you know, white supremacy at that point is now being exported as a global product, as a global commodity. It's the height of, even though the transnational slave trade has diminished at that point because of laws passed throughout Europe and then eventually in the United States, the importance of the empire, the importance of the British Empire, the importance of the Dutch, the importance of the French, and all those who had colonies, was they really had to write out, in order to justify their domination of this continent, you have to basically write all of that out. And so all of that history, you know, if you stop teaching it, or if you start lying about it and start saying, no, actually the Egyptians were white, And so we're gonna portray them as white, even though the Arab conquest of Egypt doesn't happen until 639. So that's long after the Pharaonic dynasties. And so the Arab conquest, which is a lighter-skinned conquest of the area, doesn't happen when the pyramids are being built. That happens well after that. It doesn't happen during the great Pharaonic dynasties. It's well after that. But then our religious iconography also contributes to that, because around this time, as Christianity is spreading and is becoming this sort of dominant linked to empire religion, and what's the iconography of Jesus and everyone that he knew? Well, they're all light-skinned, blondish brown hair, blue eyes, right? And so if you're going to say that this thing that we now call the Middle East, which is fascinating to me, that we call it that, because I've never understood, like, middle of what? East of what? It's also north of something. And if you actually look at a map, you'll notice what it's north of, and you'll notice that it's only separated from the place we call Africa by a man-made canal called the Suez, which is not nearly as wide in truth as it is on a map, right? Just like Africa is not as small, as it's much bigger than it is on a map, and the Suez Canal is much smaller than it is on a map. And if you look at it, if you know anything about plate tectonics and the way that continents move, you see that this thing called the Middle East was certainly, it's not Asia Minor, it's Africa Major, right? But you can't say that, because then Jesus might not be white. And if Jesus isn't white, then, oh my God, then what does that mean? And so I think as all of this is happening at once, you have the spread of white supremacy making it necessary to write out African achievement in history, and you have Western Christianity creating symbolism that also, even if it doesn't require it, pretty well pushes in that direction and says, well, now hold on a minute, if Jesus was sent to Egypt to get away from King Herod, that's the biblical story, right? So, he went to Egypt to get away. Well, then Egypt couldn't have been dark. He would have stood out like a sore thumb. He must have been white, just like him. I mean, there becomes a weird sort of white supremacist logic to it. And I think after several generations of that, where you're not teaching the things that you mentioned, and you're not learning about those empires, which frankly were incredibly advanced at a time when, to be perfectly honest, white folks, like our people were running around, as my best friend, since we were 5 years old, he's now a professor at Cal State LA. He said, I remember in high school, he would say, yeah, African folks were building dynasties when our people were still running around shitting in the woods, pretty much. And I mean, that may have been a very indelicate way to put it, but it's not altogether wrong. And even Herodotus said that. I mean, Herodotus, who was viewed as the father of history by white people, and because he was this Greek, historian, and he's credited with some of the earliest histories of the world. And what did Herodotus say? Herodotus had all kinds of positive things to say about Africans. Nothing positive to say about Europeans at all. In fact, he said they were slothful and lazy and violent and just wanted to kill and drink the blood of others, and it was just horrible. But Africans were actually pretty cool. They're not as good as the Greeks, of course, because the Greeks thought that nobody was as good as them. But by and large, the African civilizations about which he knew were much more advanced, and they were dark-skinned civilizations. That's what he said. But if people didn't know that, then you can't teach what you don't know. And so if you've had 100 years of miseducated people who don't have any reason to know that stuff, either because they don't read the African scholars who have kept that history alive, or they don't even read European scholars like Basil Davidson, a white Brit who has written 7 or 8 volumes on African civilization. So for those white folks who don't want to trust black scholars because they have an incentive to lie, whatever, Basil Davidson is a Brit. He's a member of the empire, and he wrote all these books that say the very same thing. So take your pick. White scholar, black scholar, the truth is the truth, but if you haven't learned it, then you can't teach it. And I think that's what it is now. I meet teachers all the time who, I think if they knew that stuff, they could teach it. And if they knew it, they would teach it. And it's not just the white teachers that don't know it, right? It's the black teachers who don't know it. It's the teachers of color who also haven't been exposed to it and have been given the impression that Africa was just this backwoods place. And then what happens, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, a friend of mine who I worked with for several years as an advisor to the Race Relations Institute at Fisk. He used to be the director of it, Ray Winbush. He's now at Morgan State up in Baltimore. But Ray was telling this story one time about his late 90s. He had signed up, or maybe early 2000s, he had signed up for a wire service on his cell phone, and this was like before smartphones. It was just, old school flip phone or whatever. And he signed up for some kind of special wire service that brought news from Africa. And he was, he traveled to Africa many times. He's an Afrocentric scholar, incredible intellect and wonderful teacher. And he wanted to get news that he knew he wasn't going to be able to get about the continent of Africa from ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, all that. So he signs up for this wire service, and about a month in, he canceled the service because he said, the only news that ever came over the wire was famine, AIDS, death, war. It was always something horrible. There was never anything about the positive things that are going on in Africa, which he had seen himself because he goes there all the time. He takes student groups there. He's like, I know that there's this other story, but I can't get even a wire service dedicated to Africa that's actually being run by African people. Even the news they're putting out is all about how terrible and how horrible and how, Bono is going to save us. And if it's not for Bono, how are we going to survive, And it's like, really depressing. And so if that's the only news we get about Africa, which really it is, and that goes all the way back to the mid-'80s and We Are the World and the relief concerts for Africa. Not that these were bad things, they were fine, but it was just sort of that whole mentality of this is a really horrible, tragic place. And we're not going to talk about why it's tragic, if it's tragic. We're not going to talk about any of the historical reasons why, if you have a continent of people that is depopulated, 35% of its human population stolen and either brought to other countries or die on the trek to the coast or in the boats, a third of your population on the continent wiped out, you're not going to have the kind of growth after that Europe is having, where the population is tripling. Right? Because the more population growth you get at that time, the more dynamism economically you're going to have, the more cultural interaction you're going to have. So the areas that are populating fast are going to have more growth, and they're going to have more dynamism, and the areas that are being emptied out of human beings are going to have less. That's basic. But if you don't know that, then it becomes really easy to say, well, gosh, they just can't get it together over there. They must be inferior. And maybe we'll feel sorry for them, or maybe we'll say to hell with them. But either way, it's still based on this notion of incapacity. Like even the people who want to help Africa, right, unless they have a real understanding of white supremacy and capitalism and the way that these things have conspired to as Walter Rodney puts it, how capitalism underdeveloped Africa, unless they looked into that, it's even your most caring, compassionate person is going to still have, I think, a very negative view of Africa, not only historically, but even today.
If you please allow me a quick
Sure.
second question that is related to
Sure,
this.
go ahead, yeah.
I want you please to expand and elaborate on your views about Christianity, because of the fact that this is a quite interesting idea or concept that I actually found out, is that in Ethiopia, which the Bible mentions that region several times throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you still have factions of Christianity inside of Ethiopia, which are called Orthodox Christianity, and the women still wear the same kind of clothing that we see in the Western iconography, which we have never seen being worn in Europe.
Right.
So even in ancient Greece, and not ancient, but in the Constantine period in Europe, some of the earliest images of Jesus Christ and the apostles had a darker skin hue than the images that we see today. In some of them, even they had very curly hair, not like quote-unquote Middle Eastern curly. I'm talking about African type of curly. And if all of this evidence is there, why is that they cannot put, let's say, for example, in the churches, like Ethiopian-looking images, because they will be more accurate than the images that are being used today? And related to this, to finish this, why is it that Christianity has been portrayed as an European religion, while in reality it will be more accurate to say that it's an Afro-Asiatic religion?
Right. No, and it's interesting because the evidence that you mentioned is really sort of hiding in plain sight. I mean, first of all, the Vatican, for instance, does have several paintings in their own possession, and they are displayed in the Vatican. They're not hiding in a basement somewhere, that picture a dark-skinned Jesus and dark-skinned Madonna. And so they're right there. And everybody, the church knows it, but I think what's happened is we've just sort of finessed what that means. You can go to the British Museum, and there's a coin on display in the British Museum that comes from 600 era, 600 years after the death of Jesus, during the period of Justinian II, emperor at that time of the Roman Empire. And there's a coin with Jesus' picture on it, and it's very clearly an African male with, as you said, very curly and not Middle Eastern quote unquote curly, but African curly hair. The Bible itself doesn't have a whole lot of descriptions of Jesus, but the only ones in there, not that we should take the Bible literally, I don't think by any stretch, but if you're going to, and of course the people that don't like this are the ones who always take every other part literally, except the part that says that Jesus had, skin the color of burnt brass, and hair like wool, and feet the color of copper, or something like that. Which, a suntan won't do that to you. Like that's a longer process. So that's the only descriptions we have. And yet what the church will say when you bring that up to very religious white people who are very conservative and don't want to talk about this, they'll say, well, that's all in Revelations, and that's all metaphor. Oh, really? Because the rest of Revelation you don't think is metaphor, you think is literal. So how is that? Like, they pick and choose, and I think what's happened is, and I'll tell you, this to me is the bigger piece, is that what we've done is whenever you bring that up, now I'm not going to say whenever, because there are times I've brought it up, and I've actually had white Christian, even very conservative Christians, who are at this point now, and I don't know if they always would have been, but they're getting there slowly but surely, where they do acknowledge, yeah, there's got to be a reason we changed the imagery. There's got to be a reason that, Michelangelo paints Jesus at one point the first time, and really doesn't look at all like, first of all, he was like a big beefy Jesus, and he had like short hair, and that was, Michelangelo's rendering was not at all like Warner Salmon's, and if you've seen a more recent rendering, it's Warner Salmon's Head of Christ, which was done in like 1940, and it's been reproduced 25 million times. It's the most common, you see it on the Christmas cards, and it's the most famous, iconic image of Jesus ever rendered. But even that was, early, it wasn't that. It was earlier. Before that, it was a different looking white guy. Then it was a darker skin. And I think what happens when you bring it up, though, and this has been my experience, is that people are very quick, in many cases, to say, well, it doesn't really, and I've had this happen, people say, well, it doesn't really matter what Jesus looked like. It only matters what he did. Well, okay, cool. I'm cool with that. I'm Jewish, so it doesn't mean as much to me as others, but I'm cool with that. Like, okay. So if it only matters what Jesus did, then why the hell did you make him white? Like, you don't need to actually portray him at all. Why don't just make him black for a year, and then you can change him back. You can change him. You can do Photoshop every year, make him look a little different. And they all like, no, you don't get it. We don't need to do that because it doesn't matter. Well, it must matter because you won't change him. Like, you actually, and you demand, whereas, in Islam, you don't represent physically the Prophet Muhammad. You don't represent Allah. You don't represent, in the Jewish tradition, you don't represent God. You do not, there are no, Jews historically did not create images. It was seen as sacrilegious. And so only, and in early Christianity, it wasn't as common. Now it's like every day, like, I got a picture of Jesus to sell your product. There's Jesus on the side of your refrigerator. There's Jesus in your oatmeal. There's Jesus on the billboard. Jesus is in my ice cube. Whatever. We're so quick to try to find images, and I have to say that I think why, and this is deep, and I don't know how to deal with it. I really don't. I definitely don't know how to deal with it. And as a Jew, I have like no authority to deal with it at all, other than to say that, he was Jewish, and so I should have some authority, but I don't know, I guess not. Is I really think, what we've done in the West, Western Christianity, has taken the story of creation and inverted it so that, the story of the creation biblically in the Western canon and throughout the Judeo-Christian tradition, at least, if not others, is one that says that God made man in the image of God. And that's a very nice story. But what we've done in the modern era is actually we've inverted it. And what it is that men have made God in the image of men, and particularly white men. And so as white supremacy has developed and deepened, it has been necessary to render God, or the one you believe is his son and part of a triad with God, in your own image. And it's, of course, fundamentally sacrilegious under a strict reading of Scripture. But for those who do it, I suppose it becomes psychologically necessary, so much so that a few years back, you may recall, I think it was in the late 90s, or no, I think it was 2000, the National Catholic Reporter, which is a big Catholic, monthly magazine, I guess, or weekly, had a contest where they asked people to draw a new 21st century rendering of Jesus because they wanted to get a new image, a more updated image. and they got thousands and thousands and thousands of entries, and the one they ultimately chose was a brown skin, now lighter than they could have, but still, for them, it was a stretch. And it was someone who looked like he could be Somali or Ethiopian, and man, they got death threats. You know, they had people saying, I'm not gonna subscribe to the National Catholic Reporter because of this politically correct nonsense. And then there was a theater in New Jersey, I think it was in Newark, that was putting on a passion play at Easter time, right? And so they're telling the story of the crucifixion, and they cast a black actor in the role of Jesus, which they as a theater had never done before, and they were getting bomb threats and death threats. How dare you do this? So it's very clear that the iconography touches a very deep taproot of where white supremacy comes from. And until the church is prepared to deal with that, it's going to be very hard to take seriously the church's claim to be about racial reconciliation, I think, for sure. Yes, I think, thank you very much. Am I being told we're done? Is this the, are you hauling me off, or?
No.
Oh, okay.
But we'll have one more question,
Okay,
and then we
cool.
probably need to get you some water.
I've got water. I think
Okay,
I'm
good. And then we'll have a book signing.
Let's do that. Yes, indeed. Okay, great.
All right, thank you for your patience.
You bet.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with your writings, and I came down with some Ann Arbor students. And it's delightful to be here, and I see we have made progress from the diversity of the room. And I was born in those times, 1963. And, you know, we were always instilled that education was the key to success, to fight racism and bigotry. But it was hard for us to focus on education when I used to wake up with tanks in my backyard and getting shot in A&P grocery stores because Governor Romney, Mitt's father, gave the order to kill because the Monday after the riots, we didn't have any food. So he knew that. So he tried to starve us out so we would comply. So in saying that, the education, we wasn't really focused on that because of what was going on back then.
Sure.
So to get us back into education, it was the sports that came along, okay? When I came out of Persia in 1976, you know, we had one coach and assistant coach, but it made us strong. It gave us discipline, you know? But we didn't know if we wanted to play football, we had to go to class, okay? So that worked out. That gave us our education. Now I left and I went to New York. My daughter was raised upstate New York. Christine's field looked like a pro stadium, you know, all-weather tracks, you know, weight rooms, 11 coaches for the football team.
Right.
Okay. I was like, wow, you know what I'm saying? Her junior high school had a football team. I never seen that, middle school. I never seen nothing like that.
Right.
So now I come back home because she wants to go to Ann Arbor Pioneer, which is a good school because she's a violinist. They won a Grammy in New York for their orchestra. I said, okay, well, we're going home anyway. So now, beautiful school in Ann Arbor. I go down to visit my high school, Persian High School, and they're running on a dirt track, just like Jesse Owen did in 1932.
Right.
So I go to the school, I say, what's going on? Well, we don't have the funding.
Right.
Because the teachers in Detroit that have, that's taking the money out the PSL for checks and labor, whatever, you know, getting paid, none of their kids go to PSL. So they don't have the funding for the numbers from the federal government. And to me, that was like, wow, so how can it ever be, the question to you, how can it ever be a level playing field when I see a school like that?
Right. Well,
I cried.
you know, when you have a system, and we've had it for a very long time, that is predicated on deliberate inequality. And let's just be clear about that, because I think a lot of times we look at our school system as being this place that we really want to get it right, and we really got, you know, and I'll talk to teachers and they'll say, education is the great equalizer. That's why I got into teaching. And people really want to believe that, in spite of the fact that there isn't any evidence in the history of this country that it's ever served that role the way it's claimed, and or that it's doing it now, because in fact, schooling has been set up to deliberately perpetuate inequality. And that's not like a conspiracy theory, that's just basic like analysis of what's happening. All you have to do is, like, for example, if we allow funding for schools to be 70% in most cases, some places more, some places as many as 85 or 90% of all school dollars to be locally gathered by property taxation, then of course, you know, you're going to have rampant inequality. If we allow students, if we not only allow, require them to take standardized tests right? So everybody in the state's going to take this test. Everybody in the country is going to take this test. Everybody in the local district is going to take this test. But we know we're not standardizing the classwork. So we're not all reading from the same book. We're not standardizing the teacher quality or the experience. We're not standardizing the curricula. We're not standardizing the physical plant. We know we're not. In fact, we brag about the fact that we're not. Because if we did that, that would be a big government solution. And we like to keep it local. Unlike every industrialized nation that we compete with in the world, we actually brag about the decentralization of our schools, even as we continue to lag behind most of those other countries, precisely because we don't take it seriously enough to create equity across the board. So then you get some kids in the United States who absolutely get among the best education anywhere on the planet. Absolutely, no doubt about it, because of those resources and because of the symbolic value of those. Because see, that's the thing I think we get twisted up. We think it's just about the dollars. It's not just the dollars, it's what the dollars represent symbolically and psychologically to a kid in school A versus school B, right? So if you go to a school where the money has been put in, where the teachers have been trained, where they've got lots of experience, where you've got honors and AP classes, everything about that school sends a message to the students in it that we believe in you. We believe that you can do this work, that you can be successful. And if you go to a school that doesn't have those resources, everything you're saying is essentially that you're not worth our faith and our commitment. And especially if the kids in school B know about the kids in school A, and they're not stupid, they know the difference in resources. That's not to say that equalizing the resources is enough, though, because this is the mistake that sometimes those of us on the left make. We act as if we just put more money in school A or B, then it would be okay. Well, not always, because you still got to make sure the money's going toward the kind of programs and the kind of education that really makes a difference. We know in Kansas City, for instance, back in the late 90s, actually, it was the early 90s. There was a court decision that was part of a desegregation order that they had to put some huge, it's 40 million, 50 million, or 200 million, some huge number, millions and millions of dollars into Kansas City Central, which was one of the big high schools there, mostly black. And they did, man. They refurbished this place. They put in all kinds of money. The facilities were grand. The classrooms were grand. And yet the performance didn't really improve. But that wasn't evidence that they shouldn't have put the money in. The problem was, come to find out, some of the way that they didn't spend any of the money on training the teachers to address issues of race and class marginalization, which if you don't know as a teacher how to deal with issues of classism and racism and inequality and low expectations, then having a really nice room is not going to solve that. Or they also spent some of the money on, this was absurd, they had squash courts, right? Anybody play squash? Yeah, right. It's a game. It's not just a vegetable you don't like, right? It's a game. And I didn't know anything about squash. I knew there was such a thing. I couldn't have told you what it was. They put squash courts and like handball courts or racquetball courts in this school. Well, these kids who were from, inner city core of Kansas City were like, what? Squash court? The hell is that? Like, it was culturally totally alien to them. Just like, this isn't of interest, so essentially you were still sending a message, this school isn't really for you. So I mean, it's partly about resources, it's also partly about the mentality. And I have to tell you that I think a lot of times what we end up with is debating about how well funded apartheid is going to be. Is it going to be a well-funded apartheid system or a not so well-funded? When instead we ought to be talking about how do we get rid of apartheid education. The only way we're going to do that is not only to guarantee that the federal government steps in with the resources that the local cannot or will not provide, but also that we have some real standardization of teacher quality and training, that we have teachers who, before they're allowed to teach in the classroom, have to demonstrate competence in cross-cultural and cross-class communication and instructional techniques. And there are very few states that have even tried to do that. Now, a few years ago, Washington State did, and they weren't successful the way they hoped, but they had a great plan, and I really encourage other states to look at it. They had a plan to actually require anyone getting a teaching certificate in the state of Washington to demonstrate. They actually created a test, and it was a really good in-depth exam to demonstrate what you knew about these kinds of issues of racial equity and how to pedagogically train and teach in a way that was equitable. And if you couldn't demonstrate competence in that, which is something they would teach you in the teacher training program, so you could pass it if you paid really close attention, but if you didn't demonstrate competence, you wouldn't be allowed to teach. And they actually created this rubric for discerning whether you were competent by getting money from the federal government under the No Child Left Behind Act. They actually wrote a grant, and they said, what's leaving our children behind is institutional racism, so we would like $50,000 real simple grant to create a rubric to test our people to make sure they know what they're doing. And the government said, sure. And they gave them 50 grand and they created the rubric. And then the state legislature said, we're not going to implement this. But they did it. They did create it, and I think other states can talk about how can we, if not require it, at least really create that type of rubric so that we can begin to expect of our teachers that this is just one more area of competence that they've got to have. Because you can have a really well-financed school, but if the teachers are good people who still don't know how to teach in a way that reaches everyone, because not all learning styles are the same, not all teaching techniques work as well for some as they work for others, which is just, you know, something that's been studied to death, but a lot of teachers don't know sort of what it says, then they're not going to be able to reach all students. So I think we've got to deal with the money piece for sure, but we also have to have certain expectations, not only on the kids, right, but on the teachers. We have to expect them and assess them on how well they do, not with the kids at the top of the spectrum, for whom, you know, probably anything you did would work to some extent with those kids because of their pre-existing advantages, but that they have to also be able to work with everyone across the board, or else you don't keep that job. You know, that would be, I think, ultimately the kind of requirement we're going to have. We're going to have to expect teachers to, you know, because any other job you had, if you only were able to reach certain people effectively and not others, you would lose your job. Right? If you were making tennis shoes and nobody bought your shoes, or only a couple of people did, but everybody else hated your shoes, they would call you in and say, you're not very good. You're like, no, I am. My shoes are awesome. I love these shoes. Well, nobody else seems to. They're not buying them, so you're not good. But when it comes to this, we sort of act like, oh, well, the fact that you can't reach those folks, well, nobody can. At least you tried. That shouldn't be good enough. We need to really start cleaning house all across the board and realize that our schools, frankly, were set up to fail certain folks. They weren't set up for equity, because you do understand, right, that if everybody got a good education, and this is the mindset we have to challenge, if everybody got a good education, who's going to pick up the trash in my neighborhood? Who's going to clean the bedpans at the hospital? Who's going to do the really hard work that we educated folk think we're too good for? Right? In other words, we have a system of inequality because we got all these jobs to fill that are not for people with college degrees, and if everybody goes to college or even just gets a good high school education, they might not want to do that, and then what? Oh my God, right? So inequality works because our larger society functions on inequality. Unless we challenge that mindset, we're going to keep creating the schools like you described, some of which will be really well financed and do great stuff and be very effective, and others that will not.